morning, everybody, and welcome to All Saints Day, where we remember those who have passed on. Well, technically, All Saints Day is November 1st, following All Hallows Eve, which we call Halloween. But we don't have a liturgical space in our lives to dedicate a Tuesday of our busy schedules to this day, so we recognize it today. Now, the people who have loved us and passed on have left their marks upon our life. And those marks can be, parts of our vocabulary that match theirs, certain words that we picked up from them, different mannerisms that we mirror with our hands or eyes or face or whatever. Maybe hobbies that they taught us to love, maybe interests that they had that sparked our own curiosity. And of course, the way they loved us, that taught us how to love others. So I like to remind people that at funerals, when we love people in our life, we don't just love it with our love, but theirs as well. Because love is something very tangible and powerful that cannot be destroyed. Well, love was strong enough to, in Christ's life, to overcome death. And now Christ offers that life and love to all of us. Now, as the people of God, we are the image bearers of God, meaning we are to reflect the character of God in this world with how we live. Now, Jesus taught us how to do this very practically, and then lived his life in such a way that illustrated this teaching. Now, the foundation of this way of life is found in today's passage for All Saints Day from Luke chapter 6. It's actually a very well-known passage that serves as the foundational practices and perspectives of those who claim to follow Christ. And is a description of the kind of love that God has for all creation. And the kind of love that we talked about earlier that was powerful enough to overcome death. Now, it's not an easy passage by any means because it commands us to love. And it commands us to love to the extent that we're even loving our own enemies and those who oppose us. So you might be very familiar with the passage. It's called the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and in Luke, it's the Sermon on the Plain, the flat place. So here's a quick summary. And it says this: Jesus looked intently at his disciples and spoke these words: "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those hungry right now, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are those weeping right now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you and cut you off and slander you and tarnish your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Be very glad on that day, and even leap for joy, for your rewards are many in heaven. Their fathers treated the prophets the exact same way. But how dreadful to be rich, for you have your consolation in full. How dreadful to be satisfied right now, for you will one day be hungry. And how dreadful to laugh now, for you will lament and weep. How dreadful, again, to have men speak beautifully about you, for their fathers treated the false prophets in that same manner. So I speak to those who can hear. Love those who oppose you. Do beautiful things to those who detest you. Speak blessings on those who utter curses upon you. Offer prayers for those who mistreat you. And if you're struck on the jaw, offer the other side to them as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt. Give to all who beg, and do not demand back what has been taken. Do for humanity what you would want done to you." Okay, classic Sermon on the Mount, or Sermon on the Plain, because we're in Luke. Now, there is just so much going on in this passage. And it's really hard for us to hear this in a modern day. Because what this is, they're nonviolent survival techniques for those under severe oppression. And it's not ways of keeping the oppressed under the oppression of the powerful by having them become doormats. They're survival techniques for those under severe oppression. And we can take this in just so many different ways. But my question for today specifically is, why does the liturgical calendar have this passage for All Saints' Day? And at this point in writing the message preparation, I really didn't know where it was going to go. And it just kind of explored. So hang on to your hats. We're going to explore that question specifically in the next couple of minutes. See you soon. I want you to imagine that you won the lottery today. I bet you're going to make some kind of announcement about how blessed you are, right? You're going to go on Facebook and you're going to tell everybody. Excitement and elation is going to overwhelm you. I mean, hey, as it should. That'd be pretty sweet. Now, contrary to that, if you lost your job because you told the truth, you'd probably wonder why the world is so messed up that you get punished for doing the right thing. And you might question why God didn't bless you for doing the right thing. Seems pretty natural to me. Now, today's text is a scandal to that entire value system because it uses the words blessed and woe. Now, in the economic system we find ourselves in, we have very rigid value systems that defines what it is and what it means to be blessed. Usually around material goods, physical health, financial abundance, all that kind of stuff. Hey, nothing wrong with those things. I particularly enjoyed them myself. But we would consider ourselves blessed if we had those things. And we would also consider ourselves waiting for blessings when we don't have them. And they most certainly make life a lot easier to handle in our culture. No need to glorify hardship. It can actually be very degrading and dehumanizing to live in poverty and need. Now, there's this academic guy who wrote an article. His name is Elmer Douglas. And he wrote about this idea, and he says this about poverty. Poverty often brings with it sickness, disease, epidemics, unsanitary housing, slum conditions. Poverty dispossesses its victims of the amenities to which the affluent believe themselves to be entitled. Furthermore, it deprives them of the cultural advantages that are indispensable for individual growth and development in an evolving civilization, such as respectable clothing, decent housing, education, travel, and participation in community life on a basis of equality. These are all things that make participation in our society essential. We need these things. So when Jesus says, blessed are the poor, we can tend to romanticize the idea of being in poverty as being good for our overall well-being. But he does not mean blessed are those in a state of poverty, as is better than the opposite. Nor is he saying blessed are the systems and circumstances that brought about poverty in people's lives. For Jesus is actually against dehumanizing of people. And the Gospel of Luke is very concerned with the poor. So speaking out against these systems eventually gets Jesus in trouble with both religious and governing authorities who align together to kill him. So Jesus is not saying being in poverty is a blessed thing. Jesus instead is extending blessing to those abused by the cultural, economic, and religious kingdoms of the present world. Now, there's a big difference. Those who either abstain from participating in the soul-crushing values one needs in order to get ahead in abusive systems of the world, or those who have just been run over by it altogether, Jesus has extended the definition of blessing to them. Jesus is giving hope to people who believe themselves to be hopeless, saying the kingdom that God oversees does not overlook you, as the other ones do. For the word reward used in this phrase, great is your reward in heaven, yours is the kingdom of heaven, is the same word that describes wages due to a laborer after working. So Jesus is actually helping people see that there are hardships in life that often come from those who they often come from those who have amassed the authority and material wealth to afflict them. Somebody, somewhere, is counting and keeping track of these abuses. Now, this world may abuse you and exclude you and overlook you, but God does not. The kingdom that God oversees belongs to you. This is radical teaching of what Jesus is saying here. So those in a state of mourning, if you've experienced the loss of a loved one, are experiencing a kind of poverty. Now, death, the great enemy of God, is an oppressive and abusive force within this world that steals away those that we love. No need to romanticize the suffering of those who experience loss with insufficient theological cliches. Death is not God's plan, nor is it used by God as a tool to make you stronger. This passage is not meant to explain away grief, but make space for hope in the midst of darkness, with the reminder that we are not forgotten. The kingdom of God belongs to you. Now, when Jesus says this phrase, a king's kingdom would belong to the king, and then everyone else would be a subject to the king. But God's kingdom is shared with all of us. This is something that is very different. Now, all of the things most real in this world, like goodness and truth and beauty, it's already yours. It's not enough to make you blessed and successful within the world's economy, but it's the enduring things that make life worth living, which no one can monopolize, and even death cannot take it from you. Now, a friend of mine passed away in 2019 from a terminal blood disease. He actually lived with it for 15 years, and I've never really met someone so comfortable with their own mortality before. But he would constantly talk about his approaching death with the same tone that he would talk about his approaching dinner at 5 o'clock. It was just really odd to have someone so comfortable with the topic. Now, when his sickness finally did put him into his last days in hospice, I visited him. And he was sleeping because medications were pretty heavy to control the pain. But I could see that his face showed the discomfort. And then one round of pain was so great that it woke him up suddenly, and he sat upright, clenching his teeth, looked me straight in the eyes and said this: "Death is easy. It's dying. That's the hard part." And he died that night. Those were the last words he spoke to me. And I never forgot those words. Now, death has been called the great equalizer of humanity, right? Rich, poor, powerful, powerless, famous or unknown, sinner and saint. Everybody's going to experience death at the end. And it doesn't matter how much money you have or how much power you've accumulated. We all experience this. We are finite, we are mortal, and we are limited beings. And those who accumulate the powers of the world can actually live in an illusion of godlike power, of immortality. But it does not last. Death does not play favorites, nor can it be bribed. So when Jesus hands out these woes on the rich, full, and laughing, we must keep this in mind. There isn't anything morally wrong with laughing, thank God, or eating, or even having a nice bank account that you worked very hard to earn. What the woe comes from is the illusions that these can reinforce, that we are somehow elevated beings and better than those who are not laughing or full or rich. Now, Luke is very concerned with those in physical poverty. In Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount here, which we're going done, it is not a sermon on the mountain where Jesus climbs the mountain like he does in Matthew. This is actually the sermon on the plain, and not an aeroplane, but a plain, as in a flat place, a very flat place. Now, what I think it makes the difference between the mountain and the plain and the sermon being delivered on those two different places is that Luke is highlighting the need for equitable access to life's resources by having everyone on a level plane as Jesus is speaking this message. They're physically on a flat place. So it fits so perfectly with death being the leveler of humanity. It starts its work early too. Not just when you die physically, but when you lose a job, when you experience, like that's a kind of death that you experience. When you lose your health, you experience a kind of death. Death is at work in our lives early on. When you lose a relationship, you experience a kind of death. And when you lose someone you love and they pass away, you experience a death. It is not your death, but it is something in your life has died and disrupted everything, and you have to figure out how to put it all back together on the other side and come up with some kind of a life on the other side of death and resurrect something. Now, mortality is not an experience later on at the end of life, as we can see. Mortality is a state of being that we exist within. Now, according to this passage, the poor often live without the illusion of immortality because of their limited access to things that lighten, sweeten, or enhance the quality of life. The rich, full, and laughing can oftentimes maintain the illusion of invincibility or immortality by putting the uncomfortable, harsh things of life at bay. Now, we all experience death, but some of us can put off the dying process with resources. And death is this great teacher as well as a horrible thief. It teaches us to live within the boundaries of reality and time and humanity, but it also teaches us to savor beauty because the ride ends one day. It teaches us to live open-handed and surrendered instead of clenching and combative, which is most certainly justified sometimes, but not necessarily the most helpful way to be in this world. The hard thing to do is to live in the paradox of death, both as great thief and as great teacher, without trying to resolve those two things. On one hand, death is a thief and can teach us empathy and compassion for those walking on the difficult path. It steals things from us, but we can then understand empathy and compassion for others. And on the other hand, death as teacher can help us live in the beauty of the limited now, this moment. So how can we live in this unresolved paradox? Death is the great enemy of humankind, and Christ has some words about loving our enemy that applies to this situation. So let's explore that part next. Now, human beings like you and me tend to naturally be inclined to be selective with who we love. And by love, I mean to wish the good of another person, to hope that they succeed and find happiness. And when we have the power to contribute to their happiness, we do so. That's what I mean when I say love. So we tend to save that posture for those who return it back to us. It seems to be our factory settings up in our brains, to wish good upon those we like and ill upon those who oppose us. And it takes a lot of inner work to actually overcome and override the factory settings in our brain. So how do we do this? We need a great teacher to help us see. Martin Luther King Jr. Actually preached an entire sermon called Loving Your Enemies. And one of the quotes there says, "There is another thing that you must do to love your enemy." Super practical sermon from MLK Jr. "When the opportunity presents itself for you to defeat your enemy, and this opportunity will present itself sooner or later, you must not do it. For love, in the final analysis, means understanding creative goodwill to all people. It simply means that you will do nothing to defeat anybody. You will work to defeat evil systems, but not individuals who are caught up in those evil systems. This is the meaning of love. And I believe this is what Jesus means when he says, love your enemies, that you seek to defeat no individual, that you only seek to uplift them." Those are some powerful words. And these words, spoken by a man severely oppressed and marginalized, unjustly imprisoned, abandoned by those who claim the same faith, and eventually assassinated for his faithfulness. So he lived this, and I think he's a great teacher for us. And he lived this in spite of its difficulty upon his lived experience. Now, you and I, we cannot defeat the great enemy of death. It's not going to happen. Like attacking it is like shadow boxing. You never really make contact with your opponent, and you exert a lot of energy attempting to do so. So, what options are available to us if we can't defeat the enemy of death? Well, one, we could live in terror of death and insulate our lives from the knowledge of our own mortality by use of the comforts that Jesus mentioned in the previous woes section. Probably not the greatest option. Two, we can flirt with death by living recklessly, trying to test our mortality, hoping that we can outgamble fate and our own coming fatality. You ever notice that the word fate and fatality have the same root word? It comes from the word fate. Now, we can slip into despair about the futility of life, and all that we have built and achieved will be forgotten within 2 generations. It doesn't seem like a great option either. We can live in the naivety of reality, or the reality of death, by using theological cliches that substitute for actual faith. But all these options seem really insufficient and end up just suffocating our life by living in fear of death, which is why Jesus offers us an entirely different way of being. And he says to love our enemy. Now, it's really hard to love those who oppose you, but this is All Saints' Day, and we're talking about those who have passed on. How can we befriend our mortality? Let our limitations teach us to love and live well. We can practice loving kindness along the journey of life, giving everything away, so that we practice the art of letting go and surrendering in order to find and make space for new life and love. Now, the way of living Christ describes here in this Sermon on the Mount, or Sermon on the Plain, is the most powerful, potent life that there is. The most powerful and potent form of life that exists. It was so potent that Christ defeated death by living it perfectly, which we could never have done. And Christ actually, when he defeated death, he transformed it into a doorway for more life. So whatever kind of death you're facing, from death of expectations, death of health, death of relationships, death of jobs, death of a loved one, or even your own coming mortality and death, you can be sure that the resurrection tells us that new life is to be found on the other side of death. New opportunity is on the other side of disappointment. New perspectives is on the other side of an earth-shattering diagnosis. New love, new life, new relationships exist as we keep living. And when we're living open-handed, this is a way of practicing death so that when it visits you at the very end of your life, you can just say, oh, I've been practicing for this one moment my whole life. And then you can experience what Psalm 116:24 says when it says, when they arrive at the gates of death, God welcomes us. Well, thank you so much for joining me on my couch here for All Saints Day, our one-off for this. We're going to start a new series coming up next week for November that leads us up into Advent, which is right around the corner. It's sneaking up on us quite quickly here. And thanks for putting up with my No Shave November head start that I'm doing here. I'm getting a little scruffy, but it's going to be cool. So you're going to see this develop into a nice Santa Clausness. It's going to be cool. If you've liked what you have here and you want to partner with us in any way, shape, or form, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, subscribe on YouTube. And if you want to give financially, there is a link at the bottom of your screen that would help us keep going with these online services and in-person things that we do here in our small little town of Lanesburg. So we'll see you next week for part 1 of a brand new series. and we hope you have a blessed day today. We'll see you. The glory is very bright. You like my no shave November head start? You're squiffy.